Well, good morning, everybody. Hope this video finds you well wherever it is that you might be dealing with the coronavirus and everything else that you are working through. Today, we are going to be continuing our series and our journey, thinking about who God is, trying to understand his character and his nature. And so for today, our theme is to talk about the independence of God. God is independent. Uh, so, just a bit of background, right? So, we know that in July 4th, 1776, America declared its independence from King George of England, and we asserted that we did no longer needed the King of England. We were fit and able to operate our country as our own. Teenagers often will declare their independence from their parents. They will often say, "You are no longer in control of me." This idea of independence kind of woven throughout our culture. So when we talk about the idea of God being independent, what is it that we mean? Well, simply put, to be independent means not dependent, right? It means that you don't depend on things. So in what sense is God independent? What are we talking about? Well, Paul gives us a clue when he's having his conversation with the church at Mars, with that, not quite a church yet. He's at Mars Hill at Athens, and he has a conversation with the scholars and thinkers and individuals that are a part of the square in Athens, and they have a conversation about who God is. And it says this, Acts 17:25, Paul says, "Nor is he," meaning God, "served by human hands as if he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything." So in that particular passage, Paul's reminding us that God doesn't need humanity in creation because God's the one who gave it all. Like God is independent of it all. He does not need it back. So this is kind of hard for us to understand because for us as human beings, we are dependent beings. We depend on other things and other people and something else in order to exist. Or, for example, when you were a child, you were dependent upon your parents in order to have food, water, and shelter. Right? You would not be able to accommodate yourself that way when you were very young. In the same way, when you are in education, you're dependent upon your teachers to give you the information you need in order to pass a test and to increase your learning. If you are employed right now, you depend on your employer to provide you a paycheck. So to be human in a lot of ways is to be dependent upon others. There's in no way that we can assert our independence apart from other people. It doesn't really work that way. And to be human and to be dependent isn't necessarily a bad thing for us, right? It helps us be humble and kind and generous towards others, realizing that we need each other. We're all dependent upon somebody else and something else. There's never a moment where we are not um, independent. When we are independent, you can think even the technology we're using today. We're depending upon the infrastructure of the internet to work and the power and computers and everything else. There's lots of ways that we are dependent. However, sometimes we have the mistake of importing that idea of dependency upon God. Some foolishly, for example, believe that God created humanity because he was lonely. David would kind of argue against this as well in Psalm 50, 10 through 11. God, God says this in this psalm: "For every beast of the field is mine, the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know all the birds of the field and all that moves in the fields." In other words, God owns everything. There's nothing that we can bring and give to God that he does not already have. Everything that we have comes from God. There's no sense in which we can bring anything to God. Everything that we have is because of God. So God choosing to create came out of his generosity and will to create, not because he needed to, because he was bored or lonely. Sometimes when I've had conversations with people and they've said, "Hey, why did God make things?" Well, he was in heaven, he was by himself, and he was lonely. Now we'll get to the Trinity later, but no, God was not lonely. God's lived in community from eternity past. We'll talk more about what it means for God to be a Trinity later. But for now, God was not lonely, nor was he bored, nor was he even lacking in some quality. He is perfect in his being by himself, does not need anything, does not need creation, does not need beings, does not need the universe. He is independent in who he is. So maybe a way to kind of think about this is to think about giving a present. And what makes the present a gift specifically? Well, it's because it comes from the heart and the will. So, for example, suppose I gave my wife a present that was required. It's required of me to give her that. Well, at that point, it's not really a gift, right? Because it's coming from an obligation and a duty that I have towards my wife. What she wants is for me to give her something because of my love and generosity that I feel towards her. In a similar way, when God creates, it's not because it was required. It's not because he needed anything. It's not because he was bored or he was lonely or anything like that. It's only because he chose to create. He does so out of his own generosity, out of his own person, out of his own will. He does so because he is an overabundant God filled with generosity. So God is independent from us, doesn't need anything, doesn't need creation, doesn't need to be, doesn't have isn't lacking in some quality. He is totally independent and is self-sustaining in and of himself. That's what it means for God to be independent. He's the only being that is independent, by the way, as well. Now, there are a few implications that we're going to work through here. So we'll kind of go back and forth. A few implications of what this means. Number one, God is not manipulated. God is not controlled by you and I. So God is not manipulated. So what it means when God's not manipulated is that we don't have the ability to control and make God do what we want him to do. Some of us approach God like he's a divine butler, where we ask him things and he goes and gets them for us. Or maybe a divine genie in the bottle where we make wishes that he grants, as if he's somehow obligated to grant our wishes because he's God. No, God is not controlled by us. He does not need us, and we don't manipulate and control him. Now, one of the ways that we do this is through bargaining. Sometimes when people pray, they'll do things like, hey, God, if you provide for me in this way or do this for me, then I will do such and such for you. So God's not controlled by our manipulation. So when we pray and we're trying to bargain and manipulate God through some sort of deal, that is a violation of this idea of God being independent. We don't appeal to him in some sense of bargain. We appeal to him out of his generosity and love. We're not able to tame God. I think that's one of the things that we are trying to do when we bargain with God, when we attempt to think that God somehow owes us by nature of his position. We're not able to control and tame God. God is, as C.S. Lewis would say in the Chronicles of Narnia, he's not a tame lion, in reference to Aslan, his Christ character. He's not a tame lion. We're not able to control and have God do what we want. God is his own person, independent apart from us. See, the idea of taming and controlling the gods is pagan rather than Christian. And the pagans would sacrifice to the gods. They would bring to the gods all sorts of different, animals and gifts, food, whatever it happens to be, in order so that the gods would owe them some sort of favor or service. So, for example, if I was going on an ocean voyage, I would go to Poseidon and make my sacrifice on the altar of Poseidon so that I have a safe ocean journey. So it's kind of the idea of, hey, if I do this for the gods, then they will somehow owe me. So that's a pagan idea rather than a Christian one, to think that, if I have a bargain or some sort of duty that I perform towards God, then God somehow owes me. That's not how it works in Christianity. Our only hope is not to appeal because God owes us, but rather to appeal to God's generosity and love that he has towards us. It's not to appeal to some duty that maybe we've performed to God. The other implication of God being independent that's worth mentioning is that God is not creation. He is not creation. Now, the reason this is important is that some religions that are out there would say that God is everything. He is in the universe. He is the universe himself. This is the mistake of New Age philosophies, of animism, of Hinduism and Buddhism. Other Eastern religions really have this idea that if there's something in the universe, it's because it's God. and that whatever it is, whatever that stuff is, it's God. So God is equated to the universe. So this teaching of Scripture is reminding us of the falsity of equating God with His creation. So you could think of there's all sorts of these ideas floating around where Mother Earth and other things like that. We need to remember that God is independent in the sense that He is separate and distinct from His creation, rules over it, and is not creation itself. Be careful of using language and talking about creation in the universe as if God is somehow the universe itself. He is separate and distinct and independent of it. He would exist without it. He is fine without creation. He is perfectly content within himself. So the first implication is that we don't control God. The second implication is that God is not creation. The third implication is that it should help us to demonstrate humility before God. Ultimately, when we think about it, we're not able to control God or manipulate God, and He is not creation itself. We should remember that we are dependent beings. John the Baptist would say, if we have any one good thing, it's only because it's come from heaven. In other words, the only reason we have anything good in the world is because God has given it to us, because He's independent from us. God doesn't need anything from us. Rather, we need things from Him. We are very needy, dependent beings, and we can only go to the one who is independent. We can't offer God anything that we can have. So we approach God with empty hands, and He fills them. We don't come with full hands to fill God's reserves. Rather, we can only receive things from God. We don't give God anything that He does not already have. So, of course, there's going to be more ways that the independence of God is an important teaching. But I think these three implications are a good way to think about God's independence. So, number one, we don't control God. God is not creation, and that we should demonstrate our humility before God, not seeking to control Him, but we approach Him and we ask Him for things out of His abundance and generosity, not because He owes us in some form or fashion. So I hope these videos have been helping you to think about who God is, how you relate to God, and I hope that you continue to grow in your understanding of the God who is there. As always, if you have any comments or questions, please comment below in this video, and I would be happy to respond to you. And as always, till next time, I hope that you keep your eyes fixed on Jesus and that these things will help you to grow in your faith.